From Cardus, you're listening to The Nation and the Veil, an audio docuseries about Quebec's struggle with secularism and religious symbols. Episode 2, Politics. Has secularism replaced sovereignty as Quebec's defining question? Since the beginning of the 21st century, the debate around laïcité and the place of religion in society has been central to Quebec politics. Some could say that it has taken the place formerly occupied by the debate on sovereignty as the central polarizing question. In the aftermath of the 1995 Quebec referendum, which sovereigntists lost by a very close margin, Quebec nationalism began to redefine itself along new lines. As immigration increased, often from countries that are not predominantly Christian, the issue of managing cultural and religious pluralism arose. The debate about religious symbols has increasingly come to embody this wider cultural concern.
Part 1. The Crisis of Religious Accommodations. Starting in 2006, several news stories regarding religious accommodations shocked the public. They raised frictions between religious pluralism and mainstream Québécois values. A YMCA gym in Montreal installed frosted windows after complaints by Hasidic Jews who were offended by the sight of women working out in gym clothes. The Montreal police directed its female officers to let men intervene with Hasidic Jews as an accommodation to some men who refused to talk to women. The Québec Commission des droits de la personne et de la jeunesse ruled that the Société d'assurance automobile du Québec has to comply when a man asks not to be served by a woman for religious motives. Many of these accommodations were seen as violating equality between men and women and thus greatly disturbed many pundits and citizens.
The Multani contre Commission scolaire Marguerite Bourgeois decision by the Supreme Court of Canada ruled that a Sikh student had the right to wear his kirpan, which is a small dagger, at school under certain conditions, which the school board had prohibited because it was seen as a weapon. The lawyer Julius Grey represented the plaintiffs in the Multani decision and in another case touching on religious freedom, Amselem.
We read a profile on you in Le Devoir from 2014. So, you know, the profile said that you are difficult to categorize. You are a Montrealer, an Anglophone, Jewish background, Quebecer, lawyer, Francophile, a cosmopolitan man, and you describe yourself as le moins multiculturel de tous, the less multicultural of all.
Yes, absolutely.
So,
I'm against multicultural. Totally. I think it's one of the great mistakes Canada made. I'm basically a person who does not like identities. I love all four languages that I know well, but I never choose. For instance, if somebody asks me English or French, I never choose. I say what you, as you wish. And I am very much internationalist and so on. Now, another thing that I am very strongly is in my own life, completely and utterly non-religious. I have no religion. If you ask me whether I'm Jewish, the answer is no. I have nothing to do with it.
We asked Julius Grey for his views on Bill 21.
Quebec is wrong because they're picking on the wrong things. Mm-hmm. They're picking on what people wear, which interferes with individual rights. They're excluding, say, a young woman who feels she has to wear a scarf, or a young man who has to wear a turban or a kippah from public employment, which might, in fact, in my view, and I use a word people don't like these days, assimilate him. I'm in favor of that. But so I think Quebec is wrong in the means it and in the violations of individual rights and it's, there's an English saying, you attract more people with honey than with vinegar. Quebec is intent on using vinegar to try to do what I think is right, which is integrate totally so that the immigrants lose their other identity.
Can you say a little bit more about what you really mean when you say identity? Because we all have identities, and to be assimilated.
Yeah, we all have personal identity.
To come into another identity.
We all have a personal identity, yes. What I don't like is identity as a political slogan. In other words, people can have all sorts of identity, including Hasidim. You can have an identity that is an overwhelming part of yourself. Each one chooses identity. I mean, in my case, for instance, there's a portion of my identity which is rooted in Western classical music, where I simply don't, I couldn't become a Swiftie. And there's nothing wrong with it. But if I organize a political party based on shoving Wagner down everybody's throat, then I would be doing something wrong. It's something very harmful. So the politicizing, the turning of identity into political influence is particularly dangerous. In fact, of course, it's not the members of the identity group that benefit from that. It's the leaders. It's the leaders who get the money, the leadership, the subsidies from the federal government, who have all political parties courting them. So when it comes to Bill 21, I think Quebec had the right ideological idea that there should be a common culture, that people should not maintain differences over the generations. There is a real problem with immigration with respect to the percentage of people speaking French across the country, but there is no problem with immigration as long as we don't encourage multiculturalism. I think Trudeau made 3 fundamental errors in the Constitution. It wasn't his fault. I'm talking about the real Trudeau. It wasn't his fault. He did his best, but because of the provincial opposition, etc., he put in the notwithstanding clause, which is unfortunate because you don't need it. You've got Section 1 anyway. You can't. Obviously, there are limits to charter rights, but you don't need the notwithstanding clause, giving provincial premiers that sort of power, or the federal government, actually. And Poilievre is threatening to use it on minimum sentences. So that's one mistake. The second mistake he made, I think, was multiculturalism. I think he did that because that was necessary in order to get everybody on side with bilingualism. But I don't think multiculturalism was a good idea. I think a society should not have groups. And Joe Clark once said Canada is a community of communities. That sums up what I think Canada is not. I think it's every citizen making up his own cultural, whatever background, country of individual freedom and social democracy. That's the other side, certainly not from the right. The third mistake, the most controversial one, we don't have to go into it, but I could get pilloried in the canceled, is Native autonomy. I don't think any group should have autonomy in our society, and I do not believe land belongs to anyone. It belongs to all people. It doesn't belong in property sense, but it welcomes all people, and they're all equal on it.
So for the audience that's going to be listening, briefly, just what was that issue with the Multani decision, and how was it resolved, and then by what principles did the court? And then can you say, like, why do you think that particular decision had so much prominence when?
Well, Quebec is a very Quebec has a very strong anti-violence thing today. It's one of the things: no violence, no vehemence, politeness to everybody, and so on. Maybe other places are going in the same direction. So they always had, say, codes in schools saying no knives, no weapons, etc. And of course, in the Sikh religion, a baptized Sikh has to have, among other things, a kirpan. Kirpan is something that looks like a little dagger, very small, not usually very sharp, but you have to have it on you. and they asked for it as a reasonable accommodation. Everywhere else in Canada, it passed unnoticed, but in Quebec, there was a real reaction. And a reaction was sincere and honest. I don't blame people. Were really angry. You're bringing a knife into school. But the fact is, there was no cases, and we had it in our factum, where that knife in school was used for violence. And they tried to look for cases, and they couldn't. And second, and it wasn't a real knife. And the Supreme Court dealt with it. And it was one of those clashes where English Canada was largely for the accommodation, but French Canada was not. The Amselems, the Orthodox Jews, when I represented the Sikhs, I told them all before that I'm very happy to represent them and I believe in their cause. But I want you to know that I believe, unlike you, that the purpose for the Kirpan in public school, or the purpose for the religious Jews getting their sukkah in the sanctuaire, which is a fashionable French condominium, is to integrate them so the next generation doesn't. The next and they accepted that. I don't think they were pleased with the idea that their grandchildren would not, but they accepted it. And that was my view. But in pure theory, I think Quebec has the right idea, but the wrong method, and English Canada has the wrong idea, but a method that is more, in my view, more conducive to integrating.
Initially, there was great political reluctance to tackle the reasonable accommodations issue, even for the sovereignist Parti Québécois. What made the debate go from anecdotal to political was a citizens' movement in a small Mauricie town called Hérouxville. In 2007, at the initiative of a councillor named André Drouin, Hérouxville, population 1,300 inhabitants, adopted a code of conduct, Code de vie, emphasizing that Islamic religious practices were not welcome in town. The code stated, for example, that women were not to be stoned or burnt with acid, have the same rights as men, that pork and alcohol could be consumed. The story was quickly picked up by the national media, and the village was mostly ridiculed and described as bigoted, intolerant, and xenophobic. We spoke to the legal scholar Stéphane Sérafin about this event.
My name is Stéphane Sérafin. I am a member of the Bar of Ontario and of the Bar of Quebec. So I have a bijural legal background. I grew up in Ontario, so I'm a francophone, first language francophone, but I grew up in Ontario, so I'm kind of, we're discussing cultural crossroads. That's kind of been my life's experience up till now. So the reasonable accommodations debate in Quebec, I think, dates to, I can't recall exactly the date, but I think it's 2008. It had to do with, it started primarily out of a place called Hérouxville, which adopted this was kind of like a bit of a populist moment in Quebec, if you will. The news media, the traditional news media did not react very well to these individuals. Small town Quebec adopted a code of conduct that was aimed at prohibiting Sharia law, prohibiting stonings, things that they associated with Islam, rightly or wrongly. And this kind of kicked off the debate because on the one hand, it was seen as kind of like an overreaction. And in a way it was. At the time, at least, I don't think there was anyone in Hérouxville who was actually Muslim. So they were kind of adopting this with no apparent real reason for doing so. But on the other hand, and this is, I think, where the debate became more interesting, it did kind of ask the question or bring up a question which had been kind of ignored in Quebec up till that point about, well, how far should we go in accommodating religious minorities? What does it mean to have like a common shared set of values to coexist in a community? What is that baseline shared commitment that we should all have? What does that mean? And especially in I think a culture like Quebec's, which is historically Catholic and historically has, and for all sorts of reasons, also tied to the preservation of its language and culture, even after the Quiet Revolution in 1960. These questions, I think, resonated particularly strongly in Quebec. It's not to say that those questions haven't been asked elsewhere, but I think the cultural context was right for this to just take off after Hérouxville. And of course, we then got into the debates, which got quite polemical on both sides over how best to approach this issue of accommodating religious difference and other differences too.
This burning hot controversy coincided with the 2007 Quebec election. Jean Charest's Liberal Party and André Boisclair's Parti Québécois tried to sidestep the debate. Mario Dumont's Action démocratique du Québec fully embraced it, denouncing des dirigeants d'organismes publics qui choisissent de mettre de côté nos propres valeurs communes pour satisfaire des demandes formulées par des représentants de communautés. Leaders of the public agencies who chose to set aside our shared values in order to accommodate requests made by representatives of communities.
The ADQ surged from 18% to 30% of the popular vote, and from 4 to 41 members of the National Assembly. And the Parti Québécois came in third, a resounding defeat for the party that had been the main flag bearer of nationalism since the 1970s. This result showed that there was a substantial political demand for, quote, defending Québécois values, and that for a sizable number of voters, this issue was more important than Quebec's status within Canada, around which most of the PQ's nationalism revolves. The issue stayed at the forefront of the news after the election, because Premier Jean Charest formed the Bouchard-Taylor Commission, chaired by Professors Gérard Bouchard and Charles Taylor, to consult Quebecers, examine the controversy, and make recommendations. The commission consulted with experts and with the public in assemblies held all over Quebec, and their report, released in 2008, concluded that there was no crisis of reasonable accommodation, but instead a crisis of perception, and that the majority of Quebecers had an unjustified identity malaise. Here is Professor David Koussens.
You evoked this accommodation crisis, but the Commission, Bouchard-Taylor, clearly said that it was a crisis of perception, that there were no crisis of accommodation, that it was really built by media, by politic groups. So it was a crisis of perception. And when you look at the law, there is nothing about reasonable accommodation. There is nothing. So we continue to do this reasonable accommodation on an everyday basis at the university, in hospitals, everywhere, and it works. And there is no problem. Of course, there are some small problems sometimes, of course, like everywhere in the society, but there is not a general problem of accommodation for now. So it's really interesting because if the law worked, it's that it was very performative in making the people believe that it has resolved a crisis, but the crisis was a crisis of perception. That's really interesting.
Among the recommendations of the Bouchard-Taylor report, 2 captured the attention of the public and politicians and shaped the debate for the years to come. First was removing the crucifix from the National Assembly, and second, banning religious symbols for state employees in positions that, quote, exercise a power of coercion and even of punishment, unquote, namely judges, crown prosecutors, police officers, prison guards, and the Speaker of the National Assembly. Charles Taylor, who was co-chair of the commission and is a philosopher who spent most of his career at McGill University, spoke to us about this era.
Getting right to the Bouchard-Taylor Commission.
Yeah.
So I'd like to hear your personal story on that. You already had an established career, and you were approached to lead a commission that you knew would be
very, very controversial.
Yes.
Because to everyone's surprise, it must be said, there was the beginning of the beginning of the millennium, there was this series of cases of reasonable accommodation.
Mm-hmm.
And reasonable accommodations is a situation where somebody wants a job, you want to give it to them, but there's a problem, so you readjust. Somebody Jewish doesn't want to work Saturday, okay, so you say work Sunday and that kind of thing. But a series of these cases arose, and they raised a tremendous malaise. And the malaise was mainly outside Montreal. That's where the great factor. It's always been in Montreal. There's more mixing and therefore more ritual propaganda, right? Outside Montreal.
Mm-hmm.
Mario Dumont was a sort of political leader of the third party at that point. Comes from Rivière du Rouge. Right?
Mm-hmm.
And so there was extraordinary worry about this. Seemingly, non-important. Because when we looked into all the institutions that had to administer the problem, in the hospital, Muslims are dying, there are the dead turned towards Mecca and so on, that kind of thing. All the hospitals said, no, it's no big problem. And we have problems with everybody and adjusting things, but we've not really had demands that are non-adjustable. So there was no crisis in the institutions, although widely believed, but there was this psychic crisis.
When you mention crisis, also in the media, it was called the crisis of reasonable accommodation.
That's right. We call it crisis, and that's why people thought hospitals must be, a state of total chaos. You say, and this is totally untrue. So the crisis was in the views of the people, the sense of malaise. Now, the commission. I accepted the commission because I realized this was very important. You not come out of this with terrible legislation. And so I accepted the government simply wanted to get out of the mess because there was an election coming up. And they said, well, let's not talk about that. In the election, name these two figures, we said. One independentist, one non-independentist, they had to go. But when we did this, we went around the audience and heard people. I really got a sense when people just took the mic and talked for 3 minutes and just said, that there was a real fear here. And I think one question that came back and back really, for me, summed it up. Est-ce qu'ils vont nous changer? Will we be changed by this? So it's the very old and very understandable fear for the Quebec identity, which is, of course, woven around the French language. But it contains other things as well, the Quebec identity. It's this fear around that which triggered off the reaction. And so I really got this point. And I can see that it's helped me understand other situations too. I mean, you look at the situation of Europe and all the Turkish workers came to Germany, and what do you have? You have all the Germans saying that we have to stress our Leitkultur, or the leading culture in the German, leading culture has to be stressed. It's exactly the same kind of reaction.
But at the same time, if I may interject, like German culture in Germany does not have the same existential anguish about their survival compared to French culture in Quebec.
It doesn't. I mean, objectively speaking. But you find that subjectively the same kind of thing happens. Can you figure this out? This is to me one of the saddest, but less surprising. In Sweden, there is not a population that has a higher moral view about international. They give more of their GNP. When a lot of Syrian refugees came into Sweden, the reaction was enough to create this new party, which has upset the balance in Sweden. They're not majority, but they undercut the voting Democrat. So there's something about being always in company of people that are familiar with culture, but it's suddenly a lot of people coming in, which creates this kind of fear. And getting over that is one of the really big tasks. So we made this report, and it was meant to calm the situation, but it really didn't.
Were you surprised by that? By the reception of your report?
At that point, I could see the wave was strong enough that I didn't believe that. I thought in the long run, I have to believe.
Yes, of course.
But I didn't believe in the short run.
Did you feel trapped in like during the hearings at one point? Did you think like, oh, my intention to appease the situation, like it's a lost battle, or
there was something from very strong emotion here.
Yes, of course. Yeah.
So we did something we thought was really clever, that we took a set of functions which we thought would really outrage people if people were allowed to wear signs and instructions, and they were really coercive functions.
Yes.
So the police, the
judges,
they call it the
crown,
the guy who's
prison guard,
prison guards, etc.
Yes.
And we sort of accepted that. They accepted that.
When you mean accepted, is it something?
He accepted. Yeah, we
accepted. Okay.
And but in general, we said there would be freedom to display one's religion if I wanted to, under the usual safeguards that are absolutely understood in the modern rights doctrine since 1948, which you can express religion anyway, unless it creates a great difficulty for others, creates inequality, and so on.
Public order issues.
Public order, and everybody understands this, and with that restriction, there's absolute freedom. Now, the two governments that took this up, the Parti Québécois first, and then the CAQ, said, "Oh, we're quoting we're following the advice of and they subtly changed the meaning, the point, right? So it was, instead of being coercition, it was authority, right? And then we can, well, who has authority? Well, teacher. See, so we got this.
Do you think it was done on purpose to create a collision with Ottawa, or more as a wedge issue for the electorate?
They wanted the wedge issue. They wanted the wedge issue. See?
Part 2, the Charter of Quebec Values, 2013-14, and Bill 21, 2019. After being outclassed by Mario Dumont's ADQ in the 2007 election and losing its official opposition status, the Parti Québécois knew that it had to pivot to regain the nationalist momentum that it had lost. Commentators call this the virage identitaire, the turn to identity. It was a recognition that the main focus of Quebec nationalists had moved away from sovereignty to cultural identity and integration of immigrants. When Pauline Marois came in as leader, she made it her mission to get back the nationalist voters who had tried out the ADQ in 2007 through a more affirmative discourse on national identity, including laïcité as a bulwark against radical Islam and, quote, unreasonable accommodations that threatened so-called Québécois values.
When the Parti Québécois won a minority government in 2012, a priority was to act on the identity agenda. This culminated in possibly the most controversial piece of legislation in 21st century Quebec so far, the Charte des valeurs québécoises, Charter of Quebec Values, championed by Minister Bernard Drinville. This bill proposed to ban the wearing of visible religious symbols for all state employees during their working hours. Notably, the bill did not include the removal of the crucifix in the National Assembly for reasons of heritage, patrimoine. The charter was hugely controversial and was criticized by most media commentators as intolerant. It consistently secured the support of a thin and quiet majority of Quebecers, however at around 50 to 55%. Several sovereignists, including former Premier Jacques Parizeau and Lucien Bouchard, publicly criticized the charter, while federalists such as former Supreme Court Judge Claire Leroux-Dubé and the CAQ, the Coalition Avenir Québec, backed it. The charter exposed that the debates around state multiculturalism and Quebec sovereignty are distinct from one another, and that ideological coalitions were shifting in Quebec politics. Charles Taylor.
So when that happened, it got Québécois, and that finished the chance of a really serious opposition.
It was then that it was identified as a kind of wedge issue.
Yeah.
and therefore, yeah, we see it was materialized during the project of the Charte des valeurs québécoises under David. Okay.
And it's a real tragedy because, I'm not an independentist, but I admired Quebec and that generation. They had a really broad view. They would have never adopted it. They would have been horrified by this kind of process. I knew Quebec personally, and Jacques Godin, and all the leaders of the Parti Québécois, up to and including Lucien Bouchard, were of this contact.
Yes.
So in a certain sense, the Parti Québécois, c'est relié. They just,
yes.
That's the word that it's taken, move away from while they're redescent for traditions. The morning. Okay, so that shows you this is very powerful.
We also spoke about this era with Guillaume Lamy, author of a book whose title in English would be Laïcité and Quebec Values, Sources of a Controversy.
I'm Guillaume Lamy, I'm postdoctoral fellow at the Center for the Study of Religion, Laicity and Law at the University of Sherbrooke. And I'm completing my second year of research on the historical debates about secularism in Quebec since the 19th century. But for almost 40 years in Quebec, we had a major political divide surrounding a single question: are you against independence of Quebec? That was the single question you need to ask to classify almost everybody on the political spectrum. But since 2007, this political divide got some competition. Another one concerning diversity build it up, and now we are talking about more than one issue, and we can classify the political spectrum in maybe more than two groups, but four. You can be an independentist and be favorable to the secularism and this the building of the secularism, or you can be independentist and against. And on the other side, you can be federalist and on the other camp. And since 2007, there is a surge of debates about all the diversity politics. For so many decades, there was one subject that you will have to avoid at any cost to stay friendly with others. It was the independence of Quebec or not. But now, if you talk about the Bill 21, you will have the same effect because we are so divided on this kind of politics. And there is, I think, no way of reconciliation, because when we had the previous cleavage on independence, there was a common ground possible between, strange to say that, but when we have a group advocating for independence and the other one to stay, there is a middle ground called autonomy. You can mix these opposite to a third way. And when we debate about economics, more taxes or less, we can have a common ground because it's quantity. It's what we have. But when we talk about what we are, can we make compromises? Can we ask to a woman to wear a headscarf 2 days a week at job? Before we started that debate on laicity and identity and diversity, we had a debate on identity, but it wasn't the same. The debate over independence of Quebec included a portion of identities. The identity of Quebec against the identity of Canada, the French-speaking against... That's not totally new, but in the 80s, in the 60s, when the other is the dominant one, when from a French-Canadian perspective, we were a minority. So we were the weak one in the equation. So it was easy to attack an identity. It was way easier because the English Canadian, they had the money, they were the majority in the parliament, the federal parliament. They have the culture, they have so many resources. So it was easy to make that debate from a minority perspective. But now, since we are debating about religions and minority, it's the majority of Quebec debating the minority identities. And this changes the climate of the debate in so many ways, and especially when you have a majority of French-speaking, I will sum up like that. I think the French-speaking in Quebec are very favorable to the secular, the Bill 21 and the laïcité bill. That's maybe more than 70%, maybe 80% of the French-born speaking. When we have that kind of majority trying to impose secularism through headscarf bans and everything, public prayer, the opponent are minorities and they speak a different language that is not the one of the superiority of parliament. They use the rights and the courts. And this is way more messy than a standard political divide, like between right economics and left economics. You will have some groups that will present themselves as victims of the majority with very rude words, okay? And the majority will have to defend against that kind of accusation, okay? And this is harsh, okay? This is way more hard, even for a majority. If I know a lot of nationalists, they are totally behind that kind of politics, banning F-cards. They judge this is one of the greatest law in the 21st century. It is, for them, the equivalent of the Charte Québécoise de la langue française and the Bill 101, okay? But from the minority perspective, from the Muslim that are opposed to the headscarf bans, this is the worst law of the 21st century, and this will give them or produce in them some dramatic memories of the government, the political parties, and of this time, okay, this period of time where for the majority, some member of the minority are the problem, or like a problem to solve.
After 18 months in power, the Parti Québécois called an election in the spring of 2014 and lost to Philippe Couillard's Liberals. The election was shaped by Pierre-Carl Péladeau, CEO of the Québécois media group, announcing that he was running for the PQ while raising his fist in the air. Faire du Québec un pays, to make Quebec an independent country. The election became another sort of referendum on independence, and the Liberal Party was able to win based on the majority of Quebecers rejecting this proposal. The charter died with the Marois government.
In 2018, the Quebec Liberal Party was defeated by a new political force, François Legault's Coalition Avenir Québec. It presented itself as a center-right nationalist party, defending Quebec's identity within Canada and promising to table a new bill on laïcité, as well as lowering the rate of immigration into Quebec. Legault capitalized on the unpopularity of Premier Couillard, seen as disconnected from Quebecers and extremely hostile to nationalism. His accusation that the defenders of laïcité were fueling the embers of intolerance was abundantly used against him. In 2019, Minister Simon Jolin Barrette put forward Bill 21 on laïcité, essentially a watered-down version of the Charter of Values. Religious symbols would be prohibited for state employees in certain positions of authority only, and for public school teachers. There was a grandfather clause for employees who were already working for the state, and the crucifix in the National Assembly would be removed.
6 years after the demise of the Charter of Quebec Values, the political mood was very different. The bill was more moderate, and the CAQ's government's discourse was about, quote, putting this issue behind us once and for all, capitalizing on the fatigue that many felt about this recurring issue in the political debate. Most polls show that about 2/3 of Quebecers were in favor of the bill, as were 46% of Canadians as a whole. As the bill was put forward, Premier Legault addressed the nation through a formal video celebrating that the laïcité debate was, quote-unquote, finally over. He ended his speech with a memorable sentence that instantly became associated with the bill. Au Québec, c'est comme ça qu'on vit. In Quebec, this is just how we live.
The bill was immediately challenged before the courts by opponents. The government used the Constitution's Article 33, also known as the Notwithstanding Clause, to partially protect the law from judicial review preemptively. The Quebec Court of Appeal did not strike down the bill in its decision in 2024 because of Article 33. The Supreme Court of Canada indicated that it would hear the appeal, and the verdict is expected to be delivered in fall of 2026, around the time of the October provincial election. The judicial review involves higher considerations than the law itself. The federal government is asking the Supreme Court to restrain the use that provincial legislatures can make of the Notwithstanding Clause. 4 other provinces are taking Quebec's side in the matter. Here is Stéphane Sérafin.
The Supreme Court judges, I think, know that they're sitting on a bomb. Okay? Everybody knows it. An appeal out of Quebec on hack, dealing with Bill 21 that curtails the use of Section 33 to strike down parts or all of Bill 21 would be explosive. For all the reasons we discussed earlier, right? Because this bill is not just a piece of legislation, it is fundamentally tied to Quebec's self-understanding as a distinct society, as a nation.
Part 3, Bill 9, 2024 to 25.
The intent of Bill 21, as stated by the government, was to turn the page on the laïcité debate and put it to rest after almost 15 years of polarization. Yet, in the last 2 years, events have propelled laïcité back in the news. In the fallout of the attacks in Israel of October 7th, 2023, and the renewed Israel-Hamas war, protests and sometimes anti-Semitic intimidation became more visible in the streets of Montreal. From April to June 2024, a pro-Palestinian encampment occupied McGill University's campus in downtown Montreal. In relation to the conflict, Islamic street prayers became more frequent in Montreal. The intimidating aspect of these mass demonstrations, including in front of the Notre Dame Basilica, made them a political issue, to the point that the government indicated it wanted to legislate to stop them.
At the end of 2024, the media started reporting on a situation at Bedford Elementary School, a public school in Montreal. A group of teachers at the school, who were Muslim, were accused of using physical violence against students, humiliating special needs students, and refusing to teach part of the curriculum relating to science, ethics, and sex education. An inquiry also found troubling evidence that these teachers were engaging in intimidation of colleagues, refusing to obey school leaders, and denying the leaders access to their classroom. After this, the Ministry of Education launched an inquiry into other schools in Montreal that were suspected of similar problems. In reaction to these events, the Quebec government commissioned a report from former Liberal MP Christiane Pelchat and Professor Guillaume Rousseau on how to enhance laïcité in Quebec. The report was released in August 2025. The report's title speaks of increasing the coherence of laïcité in Quebec, and went far in its proposals to do so. Whereas Bill 21 only legislated on state institutions, the Pelchat-Rousseau report went further, recommending that the state have no contact with religious groups or institutions, withdraw public funding for independent religious schools, and withdraw tax exemptions for religious organizations. This report, therefore, marked a break with previous initiatives, moving from laïcité of the state to a policy that also concerns civil society.
In November 2025, Minister Jean-François Roberge put forward Bill 9, which acted on some of the Bouchard-Rousseau recommendations. The bill bans face coverings in all education from daycare to university, as well as prayer rooms in public institutions that are not also living spaces, such as prisons or care homes. And so-called street prayers would now require prior authorization from the City Council. The bill would restrict the autonomy of independent schools by asking that they not teach religious content during school hours, and by limiting their ability to hire teachers or select students based on religion. The proposal to withdraw tax exemptions for religious organizations was left out of the bill.
As we have seen for the better part of 20 years, the debate on religious accommodations, Québécois values, and laïcité has dominated the Quebec political scene, and this is set to continue in the coming years. This issue has become a major political divide, with several distinct views on either side of the debate on the wearing of religious symbols. We will analyze these opposing views in the next episode. Thank you for listening. This podcast is a project of Cardus, a public policy think tank based in Ottawa and Hamilton, Ontario. To learn more about Cardus, please visit our website at cardus.ca. The narration was written by Étienne-Alexandre Beauregard, Lisa Richmond, and Jean-Christophe Jasmin. Hosted by Jean-Christophe Jasmin and Lisa Richmond. Produced by Francis Denis. We acknowledge with gratitude our interviewees, Francis Denis, Nadia El Mabrouk, Xavier Gélina, Julius Grey, David Koussens, Guillaume Lamy, Guillaume Rousseau, Stéphane Sérafin, Charles Taylor, and Hicham Tiflati.